Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is last week of classes. Nothing new for us. Hopefully you're hard at work at your last couple assignments. For these last videos, I am always tempted to do some sort of giant summary and rehash the various themes and topics that we've gone over the last 15 weeks. You've all read and summarized and commented and questioned and done all this so much. I don't think there's any benefit to doing that now. If you haven't learned it at this point, me saying it now is not going to help. I think you all got it. I think you all did a fantastic job with your responses. So I have a few big picture comments I want to make, hopefully pretty quickly here, and then we'll be on our way. I hope it's apparent at this point that I framed the course as a kind of a cross-pollination between archives and algorithms. And within that framework, I just want to point out three sort of bird's eye points I hope you keep in mind as you finish stuff up the next few weeks, and one sort of satellite view question of sort of what I hope you can really take out of the course going forward. You'll let me know in your course reflections what was really interesting and what wasn't. I'm really looking forward to those. And please use this video to inform how you respond, but it's not meant to be a quiz or anything on the video. This is just me trying to wrap everything up. The first thing I want to point out is the difference between the style, audience, and disciplinary training that we saw in the two halves of the class. Obviously, very different feel, in my opinion anyway, maybe you feel differently, but very different feel to me on the writings, about the writings for each of the topics. Very different kind of venues, very different kind of journals, very different kind of style. Most of the archive stuff was in a specialized archival context, right? Written in archivist archive journals for other archivists. That was true throughout, from the history stuff we read early on all the way through the community archive stuff. It was really directed at a pretty small audience. A few things were a bit further away, some of the Hartman stuff and so on. The data side of the class was a much broader audience, written for a much diverse range of people, definitely not specialists. A few things were highly philosophical and academic, obviously, but most of the stuff was all over the place. Both halves of the class were trying to raise very similar issues, if you think about it, even though different subject matters, different approaches, different styles, very similar issues. And I wonder how much, I don't have an answer to this question, but how much does the style of the different articles we read, think about the very sort of pedantic archival history, critical archival theory stuff we read early, compared to some of the more maybe energetic stuff we read in the last half of the class. And there's a mix of each in both, so it's not monolithic. But how much of the style do you think matters in terms of who's reading this? How much do disciplinary differences, the fact that one group, whichever half of the class you want to focus on, that group is probably not reading any of the stuff that the other group is. At least I haven't seen those citations. I certainly wasn't picking stuff that kind of ignored each other on purpose. I think that's representative of the field. How much does the style and the intended audience really facilitate or inhibit the uptake of some of these ideas? Would we even be reading about these sort of algorithmic issues if those people read more of the algorithmic stuff? I'm not sure. Would people designing databases and maintaining data sets about crime stats that informed a couple of our articles, would we have those same issues if those people read more about sort of the dangers of post-colonial archives that we read about? Obviously, they're different professional concerns. And it's interesting to think about, at least for me, to think about sort of how much does those disciplinary boundaries, the fact that archives kind of study their stuff in their bubble and the data society people study stuff in their bubble, and there's very little overlap, how much does that contribute to some of the issues we've been reading about in the second half of the class? And I want to be real clear that there isn't a kind of direct knowledge transfer. It's not like you're going to read Terry Cook and think, oh, I know how to design a database and collect data about crime. But you get very important questions to be asking as you're working through these processes of creating knowledge infrastructures. And that's going to be one of the themes for this final video, knowledge infrastructures and processes. How much, in the same way we read about archivists creating the world that they wanted to live in, how much do people creating data sets and algorithms, how much are they doing that inadvertently, creating the world they want to live in, rather than reflecting existing reality? So that's the first point I want to make. Style, audience, and disciplinary training. Keep those things in mind. Number 2, identity, scale, and computation. We've seen how archives inform histories. People go to the archive, they read about stuff, micro and macro scales, they create narratives. They don't necessarily inform the identities of the people they're reading about because they have their own culture and communities and traditions and so on. But they help create identities about those people for other people. So a lot of our perceptions of history and other people in other parts of the world come from what we've read, come from the stories we've heard about them. So the identity of these other people in our mind, and to some extent based on our own experience, of course, is based on these archives. It's based on what's been collected and processed and sort of turned into stories. We've seen how algorithms, on the other hand, conform to averages. It creates a kind of identity about people, about groups of people, grouped in very different ways, sometimes very commonsensical, sometimes seemingly bizarre ways. But those are identities too, right? You have a statistical identity in the 21st century. You are more likely to do X, you are less likely to do X, whether it's sort of lifespan and your healthcare, whether it's loans and financial stuff, whether it's getting a college degree and making a certain amount of money. All of these things, we all have these statistical lives now, just as we have these narrative lives from the archives. And they're really similar. And so in terms of identities and scale is obviously a theme that's been weaving in and out of the course. One question I've been struggling with is how much are histories that we get from the archive, where we like nuance and we like subtlety and we like the individual story and so on and so forth. How much of those narratives we create that create identities for other people how different are they from all the mathematical averages and stuff that we've seen in terms of algorithms? How much is our perception of society really just kind of average? Not a mathematical one, but a qualitative average of stuff we've read in our own experience. And if those processes of knowledge production are very similar, both in the archive and the algorithmic case, maybe we can learn a lot in terms of how we represent people and society by looking at how we've done it in archives and how we're kind of making the same mistakes with algorithms, and the things we've done well with archives, how that can be applied to data and so on. But histories have something else that sort of the data qualitative stuff doesn't have. And I think this is what Presner is talking about with his ethical computing. He's trying to avoid leaving out the personal experience. And many of you wrote about this in very elegant ways. I don't need to dwell on it here, but I do need to sort of restate it. He's trying to avoid leaving out the personal experience through distant reading or distant listening in order to sort of to capture that intimacy, to capture stuff that isn't going to be measured. Is there an ethical algorithm, even in some kind of fuzzy logic way, that can account for personal experience? Let's take this one step further. Let's say, okay, well, the stories we get out of archives, the identities we get out of archives and the identities we get out of algorithms, maybe they're pretty similar, right? How do you do this ethically? How do you not lose critical information as you scale up? Well, we've talked about how algorithms more or less mathematically represent existing prejudice of the archive, right? We don't need to go over that again. Existing prejudices or biases in the society that creates these algorithms and data and so on. Does this mean, in terms of identity and scale and computation and so on, does this mean it's possible to have self-correcting algorithms? Can you program an algorithm as part of what it does? Can you program it to recognize a bias? Is that even philosophically possible? Or is that outside of what an algorithm is even capable for? So I guess there's some philosophical arguments here about artificial intelligence and so on. We won't go into those. But when we're thinking about sort of what can you do to an algorithm to make it more ethical, can it be self-correcting? Can it be programmed to automatically account for known biases? Can you make an ethical algorithm that deliberately ignores predominant logic? Let's say you're evaluating a mortgage application, and you say, this person, whatever demographics or whatever sort of income level or whatever the metrics are, this person in aggregate, their profile is the kind of person who is typically going to default and not pay their bill. Therefore, no mortgage. Well, obviously the algorithm exists to not get people into spots where they are obligated to do something they can't do and lose their home and so on. So this works in everyone's interest to have these metrics and say this person statistically is going to have a problem. It's better for everyone if we say no. But what if there's some sort of additional sort of ambiguity or nuance in the algorithm itself that says, well, let's evaluate this person's story. How can we quantify that person's sort of experience against these other ones? How can we evaluate why that person or that kind of person may be in the situation they are historically, not just in their life, but why they are in that position sort of in the grand scheme of things and someone else isn't? How can we evaluate those things? Is that an ethical algorithm? If you can account for those, does it make sense even to talk about an ethical algorithm? Or is algorithms by definition sort of completely aethical, non-ethical? I'm not sure what the actual word is, but you know what I mean. Can there be activist algorithms that deliberately say, okay, I'm an algorithm. I've typically discriminated against this group because statistically, that's what I've been programmed to do. So I'm going to just every once in a while say yes, even though I'm supposed to say no. Is that a kind of algorithmic activism that would be useful, or is that completely against the point of the whole algorithm? So I think there's a lot of really interesting, pretty much philosophical questions to think about when it comes to how do you implement these, and to what extent can you use an algorithm in terms of identity and how it represents people in the real world and their actual lives and their history, and how do you scale that up in terms of computation? So I hope you'll keep thinking philosophically about those kinds of questions, even though there are no clear answers. Obviously, we've read a lot of provocative stuff the last few weeks in particular that sort of get at these issues. If I had some genius idea, I'd love to share it with you. But the bottom line is nobody knows, I don't think. But we need to keep thinking about it. I liked it. I think it's fun. You may or may not. But I think they're important questions to keep in mind as we live in a society governed by algorithms. Speaking of governance, through algorithms, my third sort of bird's eye viewpoint I hope you continue to think about: transparency, awareness, and activism. So this is sort of a triad. These aren't three separate things. This is kind of like a unit of stuff. Chris pointed out in his last post something he noticed in the gentrification article. Many of the same people making the algorithms about sort of where to raise rent and sort of where to renovate buildings and create sort of hotspots next to wherever the Google shuttle stops or whatever. The people creating those algorithms are the same kind of people, or maybe the same actual people, benefiting from the algorithms, right? They're literally shaping the world around them through this algorithmic tool. So this observation, I think, is very interesting and prompts a very important general question, which is, who is creating algorithms? Is there any account? We talked about accountability last time. We read about it a couple weeks ago. I talked about it. Who's creating these? Who can we hold accountable for these? Where is the transparency in that? Now, you can say, well, these are private. These are trade secrets. We've read about that kind of stuff. But if algorithms are seen as a governing force in society, as a law, right, a kind of a mathematical law, so to speak, shouldn't we know? Like, we know who makes laws. We elect people to do that. We know who sponsors it, who votes which way. When we're legally bound to something, we know where it comes from. We might disagree with it. We might, be powerless to stop it. We might support it, whatever. But we know kind of where it's coming from. We know who's responsible. We can hold them to some degree of accountability. Maybe not as much as we'd like sometimes. But with algorithms, there's none of that. If you want to live in a functioning democracy, do you need algorithmic transparency? What kind of world are different people trying to compute into existence? The same way archivists, I'm always trying to link these two halves of the class every chance I get. The archivists were trying to propagate the world they lived in, right? From their position of power, of preserving what they deemed as culturally important and discarding the other stuff, right? This idea of thinking about transparency and awareness of where stuff comes from might make us rethink bigger is better, right? This is the mantra of data, right? The more you have, the more objective it is, the more it smooths over irregularities and biases and so on and so forth. But there could be real value, as we've seen with archives, big national institutional archives, small regional community archives. There's a real value, just like in history, any kind of history. There's macro history, big picture, huge historical law stuff. That's cool. That's one of the stuff that got me interested in history originally. And then there's microhistory, stories about one person, a biography maybe, or a very particular community at a point in time. We need all these different levels, all these different scales of history. We need all these different scales of archives. Maybe we need more scales of data to create these kinds of awarenesses about sort of how people are being represented through data and through algorithms. Scale, questions of scale and awareness, transparency, and potential ways of sort of engaging with algorithmic culture. Scale provokes many questions outlined in Presner. One question that Natalie posed in response to Presner's article is, how would Hartman reckon with dealing with silences caused by a surplus of historical details and narratives? Instead of having too little, can you have silences from too much? I have no idea how Hartman would deal with this, but I love the question because it immediately made me think of how much can you counter algorithmic biases through fiction? Fiction is stuff that you make up. It's stuff that you make. Can we fill in for algorithmic or data shortcomings through creating data sets that marries sort of the more interpersonal, person-based, nuanced historical stories with raw data? Is there a way of just sort of fabricating data to tell a story of something not otherwise collected or quantified? Would this be a kind of algorithmic corrective? Would this violate some cosmic law about what algorithms can and can't do, what you can do with data, right? Imagine a data set that's completely made up just to augment data that we know is biased and incomplete. How would people feel about that? Isn't data supposed to be objective? Of course, we know it's not. But because there is that presumption of objectivity, both in the archives and in algorithms and data, the idea that you would introduce wrong data, just made up data, knowing that when you smooth it all out, it's actually going to make the result of the algorithm more reflective of actual society than the data would otherwise allow it to be. Is that something that people would look at and say, oh my gosh, we can absolutely never do that, that's abhorrent? Or is that something we would do in 50 years from now? People say, why did it take them so long to figure that out? In that case, maybe if we have this corrective, right? Obviously, this is just kind of a giant thought experiment. But in that case, would we have better data? Olivia asked a good question. What is good data? What constitutes good? A corollary question, who decides? Who is the archivist of data that decides this is good and this isn't? This is reliable and this isn't. What happens if we approached data gathering as critically as archivists have begun to approach their task of interfacing with the physical world and preserving certain aspects of it? Should people creating data about the world, there's lots of public data sets. There's open data initiatives in every city, in every state, federal government, around the world. There's a legitimate interest in creating data that everybody can access and so on. Now, how it gets used and so on, different story. But how do you ask questions? How do you know what questions to ask when you're producing this open data? Open data, I don't know why I did quotes. It's the actual term, open data. Data that other people can access. It's meant to be published and shared and used and reused and repurposed and so on. How do you ask the right questions about it? Again, going back to the disciplinary boundary question I started with. Can all the critical thinking that we read about in terms of archives and how to make them more inclusive, how to bring in more voices, more kinds of voices, how to increase transparency, thinking about ontology and epistemology. I'll spare you a summary of all the buzzwords we covered, but how can that same kind of thinking go into curating data that we use to use in these everyday algorithms we've been reading about? Where can this happen? I think is a very important question. So let's return for just a moment to the idea of creating new interfaces to visualize and understand algorithmic consequences. To what extent can community archives, not just as a place where we collect stuff as kind of we read about it, but the idea of the community archive, can that be moved into sort of the data realm? Can that be a place, both physical and virtual, a place to cultivate and correct algorithmic data, to help balance algorithmic decisions based on skewed data, biased data? And of course it always is, right? Can we create smaller but more personal, more nuanced archives that could be consulted or strung together, linked together, used in aggregate? So just as I was talking about using history at different scales, can we create these data sets at different scales, and have small ones where different people have different input into sort of how they are represented in terms of data? On one hand, this seems completely fanciful, but on the other hand, so did community archives before they were a thing. People create public data all the time. Almost all of the stuff we read in the second half of the class was analyzed through public data, right? Obviously, Facebook and Google have their own private corporate stuff. But a lot of the societal data, who's going to commit crimes, who's going to repay a loan, who's going to graduate from college, and so on, that stuff is generated from public surveys, from different kinds of studies that sociologists do or economists, and so on. A lot of this is already public data, so it's actually not quite as fanciful as it may seem at first glance. Visualization, interfaces to the data, community archives, places where people can go, maybe public libraries even, places where people can go to see how they are represented algorithmically, how they are represented as data. What demographics do I fall in? What does this mean when other people look at sort of, my income level and, where I live and education level and so on, skin color? I mean, pick a variable. When people see me from that, what do I look like on a map? Where am I? Can I visualize that? Like you're visualizing the Holocaust survivors. It seems very inhuman to sort of reduce people to that. But when people have to see themselves represented as a little dot on the screen, they're going to have a reaction. They're going to want to know why. And that's where you get a chance to, I think, to really engage with sort of the kind of data collection and processes that are underway and to really change them, right? To bring in different voices from people about what the algorithm means to them. Again, working at different scales. This doesn't scale up to everybody, right? We can't do this for 8 billion people on the planet. But when you work at different scales, right, and the community archives are at a smaller scale and you got the big giant data sets about people in general, when you can use those together, maybe we can do something interesting. If data is curated by communities and people have input, more kinds of people have input into how they're being represented by the data, maybe we could not only fix some of the biases in the data, which would be nice, but we might start to address some of the reasons the biases exist in the first place. And that would be pretty cool. Okay, so my fourth satellite view picture of the course is really about knowledge infrastructures and process control. Because we're using archives and algorithms as a means to an end, I probably should be clear that what the end actually is. And that is not just to have more knowledge about archives and algorithms. I hope you got that. I hope you got some good questions. But really what I hope you can take away from the whole course is to constantly be thinking critically about knowledge and process infrastructures. Specifically, how we create knowledge and employ it about other people. And this is what archives do, and this is what algorithms do. They facilitate knowledge creation, obviously in their own ways, right? And in different ways. But I think maybe that's where they overlap the most, and that's how they are always used, both of them. Well, not always, but mostly that's how they're used. And that's very powerful influence. Creating knowledge about people, in a way, means creating sort of almost a narrative about like the likelihood they're going to graduate from college or pay back a loan or commit a crime or click on an ad. Now, we can do this, we can make those stories through interviews and qualitative analysis, right? We can run the numbers. There's lots of ways of doing this. But ultimately, we end up with knowledge about that person, what we think is knowledge about that person anyway, and whether they can succeed at X, Y, Z, or whether they're deserving of A, B, and C, or whatever it is. How long their parole should be. All of these things that we've been reading about. We're creating knowledge about them. And it's sort of like we're projecting into the future. It's all very probabilistic, right? This person is likely, based on these attributes, likely to do this or likely to do that. Think back a few weeks. We read about the term dataism in one of the articles, and it refers to this sort of ideology of the data is the answer to everything. Right? It's like Marxism, like every good system has an ism, right? Marxism is this particular ideology about how the world should be, and dataism is the same thing. Data is going to make the world better, right? We should collect more data. The more data we have, the more objective it is, and so on and so forth. It should be noted, I think, that this idea of collecting more data, that data has more answers, big data, the myth of big data, I think it's a myth. Because it's supposedly more objective and so on, it's a lot like what we read about very early on in the course in terms of archive fever, which is a term from Foucault. I just wanted to put one more Foucault reference in for Chris. Archive fever, Foucault, was really interesting because it wasn't just about collecting stuff, to preserve the past, which is what, the archival interest was, but he was interested in studying that phenomenon, understanding what we can learn about ourselves through looking at what we're saving and what we're not, right? And this was a very revolutionary way. It sort of launched all the sort of archival stuff we ended up reading in the class. This idea of sort of interrogating the archival process as a mirror of society or a mirror of culture. Can we do the same thing with algorithms? Can we use that sort of archival fever sort of call that Foucault gave us in the 70s? Can we use that to interrogate data and our use of it in the same way? I think absolutely, obviously. I hope you'll keep thinking about that. Do algorithms generate their own archives? Yes. Do they reinforce their own biases? Yes. And the one thing to note about thinking about sort of scale and transparency and societal effects and so on, it's not just that algorithms sort of perpetuate their biases. They amplify them. It's like we've all had a Zoom call where someone didn't turn off their microphone or whatever, and you just got this horrible feedback loop and you thought the universe was going to explode. It gets worse, right? Whatever phenomenon is happening, say you're deliberately not giving loans to a certain group of people because they're statistically less likely to pay them back. Well, that's just going to happen more and more and more, and then it's going to be harder and harder and harder for them to get a loan, and harder for them to build capital and sort of get out of the reason that they're in the situation they're in, right? So there's these amplification effects that are very dangerous when we think about the implications of dataism and algorithms. My point here is about knowledge infrastructures and processes and creating knowledge about society. So when we think of, we know something about people, if there's sort of, I guess, one of the handful of takeaways for the whole course, maybe this would be one of them. If we think we know something about a group of people, whether it's through archives or through algorithms, the mechanism doesn't matter. When we think we know something, it could be a large group, it could be a particular community, whatever size or shape. I think we always have to have the critical questions that we've been looking at all semester, both in terms of archives and algorithms, in mind. Where does this data come from? Where are the presumptions of objectivity? How legitimate are the generalizations that we're making? How much of the questions of sort of colonial categorizations that we talked about long ago in the archive readings, how much are those same things, those same issues get reflected in kind of colonial computation? Are algorithms really simply mirroring the archival stuff, and it's an evolution? Can we chart out a future of sort of improving algorithms and data based on what we've seen in terms of archives? Obviously, I think so. I was just talking about sort of, we kind of marched through archives and got to community archives at the end. This is a way of sort of making better kinds of archives. Well, we've had this sort of big institutional data collection. Maybe these community sort of data collections are a way forward. I don't know. I thought it was very interesting that many of the questions about sort of the colonial archive and so on that we got sort of in the middle of the first half of the semester, none of those issues, very few of those issues, got raised in the same way in the second half of the course about algorithms. Again, disciplinary differences. I'm not cherry picking stuff. I think it's really representative of how people have been inquiring about data in society. That I think will naturally change, but I think there's a lot of cross-pollination to continue to happen. One final point on this last sort of satellite view of knowledge infrastructures and process control. The last point I would make here is that algorithms aren't strictly computational. That's how we focused on them, obviously for good reason, I hope you think. But algorithms are very much process-oriented as well. It's a college admission process. You all might be familiar with that. Is a college admission process a kind of algorithm? Arguably, yes. There's inputs, the application materials. There's qualitative elements, there's quantitative elements, you have test scores, letter of intent, and so on, personal statement. There's an effort on the part of the admissions committee to be objective, to let in people who really seem like they're going to succeed, not discriminate based on age, ethnicity, income, and so on. Lots of efforts to avoid bias. I think people do a pretty decent job in many cases. Not a perfect process, obviously. But studying what we have throughout the semester, can you imagine an admissions process, no matter how self-aware and self-critical, that doesn't suffer from almost the same problems that we've seen in terms of archives and algorithms? It's hard to imagine that there aren't the same kinds of issues there. So my point here is that when considering archives and algorithms together, the fact that, and to think about algorithms as broad processes, as not just sort of big data computational stuff, the fact that two very different knowledge production mechanisms share so much, so many of the problems, so many advantages, suggests that the kind of critiques and questions and provocations we've seen across the readings this semester, the kinds of questions and statements you've been putting in your summaries and reflections all semester, they apply to literally all kinds of knowledge production, not just about people, although that's what we focused on, everything, right? They apply to every process that you're involved in, right? When you're on a college applications committee, I hope some of the questions from this class come to mind. Okay, you're at work. Someone hands you a binder of information, a 3-ring binder. Binder clip, paper clip, whatever, a packet of information in some form. Form doesn't matter. Spreadsheets, stories, a mix of qualitative, quantitative stuff, pictures, it doesn't matter. They say, make sense of this. Tell me, what am I supposed to take away? What does this mean? Obviously, it's collected, there's some point to the binder in the first place, so it's not like totally out of left field. It's not some like detective mystery, but they want you to analyze this stuff. And I hope that all these questions from the course, all these different, ways of interrogating the course as we've moved through it, come back to mind. So you think about, from the archival collection standpoint, who collected this stuff? Where is this stuff from? Who made this binder? Where did all that information in the binder come from? What did they think they were doing? Why did they choose some stuff and not other stuff? Was there nothing else available? What voice do they privilege here? How is it organized this way? Why is these things in this order? Is that affecting the way I think about it? What about stuff that doesn't seem to fit into that scheme? Did it just get left out? What's not here? Where is it distorted, right? All these archival questions that we're now very familiar with. And then from the algorithm, sort of more data side, you can think about the implementation side. Where is this data getting used? What kind of conclusions are coming to me via this binder? How is that getting calculated? What is the normative values that are being used? What is the average? Where is that? Who is the average here? Where is it amplifying existing social biases and collection biases? Is there a way to correct it in some way? Maybe you need to take a step back and think about this whole process you're involved in. So if there's kind of one thing to take away from the class, I think it's really, my hope is that it's really your ability to step back from whatever process you're involved in, right? Not just about archival stuff or algorithmic stuff, data, whatever process you're engaged in, and to apply all these questions that we've seen on the archival sort of collection side and the algorithmic implementation side, and think about, how can I make this process better? Because a lot of people are trained to sort of go through and compute things and calculate this and interpret that, and it's just they all become an algorithm. They just apply their training to a problem and kind of spit out results in a very predictable way. Not to say that's unskilled or they're wrong, but they kind of just do it kind of uncritically because they're just following the training. They're following the algorithm. But when you can step back and get out of your own algorithm, outside of your own training, including this class, I mean, maybe you think some of the questions are stupid and there's other ones we didn't talk about that you think are important. Go for it. But when you can step back from the process and say, where is this stuff coming from? How is it getting used? What can we do differently? That's when I think you can make a real impact in whatever work you're doing. And I think you're all going to go on to do really interesting work. That's it. Thanks again for your really engaging reflections over the semester. I wish I was able to give you more in-depth feedback throughout the semester. I learned a lot. I appreciate your time and effort with them. I know it was a lot, and you took a lot of really disparate, crazy readings. Some of them were really hard, and as a set, they were really weird, and you got a lot of stuff out of them. I've gone through your posts many times. I've really enjoyed them, so I hope you can take a lot away from the class and use it somehow, some way, and I hope you'll let me know if you ever do. Take care, everyone.